Good morning, good afternoon. I really thanks to Tahani for the invitation to be part of this. I'm really excited to be here, and I've already learned so much from the fantastic group of people that she's gathered together. So thank you so much for inviting me to be in this space with you all. And I want to start actually by acknowledging some people because I want to acknowledge both my personal and professional kin whose memory keeping work has been so incredibly important to the two projects that I'm going to share today. So you see archivists of all kinds and conservators, I would say, of all kinds, just reflected in this slide. So thank you for the chance to share some of the things I've been thinking about for a long time and wasn't really sure how to connect, particularly the relationship between the conservation of cultural heritage or things, which are often done by people called conservators, and the conservation of nature or the conservation of the natural world, often done by people we call conservationists. I myself am in that first category, which is to say I work with things, objects, stuff that has been buried and excavated and is now for the most part in museum collections. And my research, as Tani just mentioned, focuses on how ancient people made things and how that tells us something about their lived experiences, perhaps their identities, and their relationships with each other and their environments. But in my day-to-day work as a teacher, I really think about and try to teach about why we conserve and study cultural heritage and how we should do this more appropriately. And I'm increasingly uncomfortable with this very strange divide between human-made and natural heritage. And even within the conservation of things or stuff, which is my area of specialization, we often separate out the care of organic materials and inorganic materials, which really reinforces the sense that some things, bones, wood, textiles, come from living beings, while other things, metals, stones, pigments, come from supposedly inert sources. So what makes an animal or plant living, but a mountain or the earth not living? And what distinct care then do once living versus supposedly never alive things need? And what is it about the heritage making process that takes things and beings that were once alive and perhaps destroys them in the name of conservation? And I realized that in the effort to not kill something, I realized my computer might die. So I'm going to plug my computer in before that happens. So just give me 1 second. Right. Well, that should save us hopefully at least one death during this talk. All right. So the title of my talk then, May I Know How You Kill Them to Preserve Them as Specimens, actually comes from a series of letters exchanged between a nurse named Miss A.C. Monroe, who served in the Canadian Baptist Mission in the village in Orissa, in a village in Orissa in North India. And here you'll see it marked in red. And Dr. Frederick W. Gravely, whose picture you see here, who was then superintendent of the Madras Government Museum in South India, also marked in red, describing the transfer of some rather unusual things. And I'll just point out the train in the blue box, which will return to us in subsequent slides. So, on September 20th, 1940, Monroe wrote to Gravely, quote, "I've posted by this same mail this week's gleaning of spiders. These are all tree dwellers. These are nasty critters, greatly feared by the primitives. I've heard of death from their like in humans, and last year a full-grown ox bitten on the back while standing under a tree near my compound was dead within a few minutes. There are about 20 specimens in this lot, alive. They may, however, fight and kill each other. The last lot I sent to the School of Tropical Hygiene did so, and out of 9 good live big ones, 3 were disintegrated and 4 killed. May I know how you kill them to preserve them as specimens?" Gravely, himself a naturalist with a particular research interest in marine life, writes back to Monroe, thanking her for her donation to the museum, and suggests killing spiders with chloroform, then putting them in subsequently more concentrated ethyl alcohol, eventually reaching up to, quote, 90% spirit, and that this should be done with a fair volume of spirit or it will be much diluted by the spider's juices, unquote. I'm assuming that no postal workers were harmed in this transfer of deadly spiders from North India to South India, but the spiders themselves were not afforded the same luxury. And here's just a warning that I'm going to show you some spider images in the next slides. If you'd rather not see them, it's just one slide, look away. So on the left is the type of spider that Monroe sent Gravely. This is the Poecilotheria metallica, growing up to the size of an adult hand, now critically endangered due to habitat loss and illegal trade. And on the right is the same type of spider, preserved as a specimen in the government museum, though this one is not one of the spiders sent by Monroe. It's startling and poignant to notice a bright blue and yellow living thing that once chloroformed and drowned in ethyl alcohol turns rust brown, and it's piteous to see it floating upside down in its spider juices isolated in a specimen jar. I'm curious and frankly aghast at the stark brutality of the museumification process, the way that the collecting and preservation of things kills living beings and turns them into unmoored items far from their trees and places and the other creatures who were their home. The rest of this talk is my attempt to sit with uncomfortable questions of what conservation is meant to do, both within the museum and outside it, what kinds of life forms conservation kills in order to preserve as specimens, and whether we can revive things and beings that have either been explicitly or inadvertently killed in the name of care. And we'll begin first in the museum with the conservator. So this is part one. So this is the Madras Government Museum, now the Chennai Museum, where Gravely received packages of spiders from Miss Monroe. Founded in 1851, this colonial institution was specifically intended as a place to display products of the South Indian region, geological and natural history specimens, botanical and textile products created by local manufacturers, and even a living zoological garden. But by the 1880s, archaeological objects, primarily in the form of Hindu bronze sculptures, but also Buddhist and Jain bronzes, as well as Buddhist bone relics, began infiltrating the museum, something that the museum staff themselves were not keen on because such items were seen as part of a living religious heritage, quite outside the museum's purview. And these types of objects, devotional items meant to be inhabited by deities and venerated by religious devotees, sat uncomfortably in a museum of useful stuff. Now, the reason for this sudden influx of gods and goddesses into the museum was the Indian Treasure Trove Act of 1878, enacted by the British Imperial Legislative Council, which designated items buried in the ground as treasure, and created a process by which objects could be monetarily valued and also collected as heritage objects by regional museums. The Treasure Trove Act comes into effect as the expansion of transportation networks, railways and roads, and as well as agricultural changes were literally churning objects out of the earth, as you can see here. And so these are just a couple of images from the Government Museum archives. The period of the late 1800s and early 1900s is also when the field of archaeology is developing as a discipline, and the Treasure Trove Act is part of a broader project in which the colonial government becomes involved in creating India's ancient past through scientific record keeping, photography, excavation, preservation, and museum work. And here's an example of bronzes found during railway construction by the South Indian Railway Company, a British-owned private company. And we should keep in mind, really, that the building of railroads was a major contributor to the deforestation of India. The caption here shows that these excavated bronzes were even displayed in the railway station, which is quite extraordinary to think about. And this was happening during the major festival of Thai Amavasya, a day when the souls of the ancestors are thought to return to earth to bless the living. So imagine being in a railway station and encountering these, quite normal and yet extraordinary objects while you're waiting for your train. Under the Treasure Trove Act, when items of treasure were discovered, they were immediately recorded, as you can see here. And these are some of my favorite images. These early recordings were done in drawings of, obviously varying qualities, but still incredibly lively. And then once photography becomes the primary way to document objects, we start to get photo documentation of these objects of treasure. And they are recorded not just in this way, but they're also weighed for their material value. And this will be important because of what happens next. So once these objects are found, they are documented, they are placed in safekeeping at the collector's office, and then there's a notification of the finds, which is published in English and vernacular newspapers, as you see here. Giving any local claimants the opportunity to attend a public hearing during which they might make a case for owning them. Now, there's a really complex story to be told here about how colonial officials determined what counted as evidence for ownership and how such decisions really sometimes enabled the dispossession of cultural heritage from their communities, but that's for another time. So if local claimants could prove ownership, and that was accepted, items could be returned to them if communities could ensure that objects would be appropriately secured, cared for, and preserved. And here too, there's a longer story of how complicated these expectations and requirements were. Now, if local claimants chose not to have items restituted to them, they were financially compensated by the government, paid the worth of the weight of the raw material rather than the value that the archaeological object would likely fetch on the art market. So they're literally weighed to find out how much bronze they're composed of, and then the market value of the bronze is what's paid. And that's what you see on the far right. These are payments to claimants. And in this case, most of them seem to have signed for having received funds with their thumbprints. So items that were not claimed or items that were specifically requested by the museum because they were seen of being particularly historical or archaeologically important and in value were sent to the Madras Government Museum for preservation. And by preservation in this early period, it's simply to keep them at the museum, not necessarily any further intervention. Now, what is really extraordinary is that we get a sense of the much messier story of acquisition and not acquisition. And let me just say, there's a lot of arguing between officers within the colonial government and among the museum staff, both British and Indian, as to whether these types of objects are suitable for museums at all and whether they should be collected. And between the late 1880s and 1947, the year of Indian independence from Britain, there are approximately 50 petitions still accessible at the Government Museum archives that show that local claimants are submitting their requests to government officials to ask for their gods to be returned to them. And I've just summarized some of the arguments put forth by both the museum and counter arguments made by local claimants here. And some of these arguments, especially on the museum side, are very familiar to us. They're similar to ones that museums make today. For example, there is no secure physical location in which these items can be suitably preserved. Local claimants do not have scientific ways of preserving works of art. More people can, of course, see works of art in urban centers rather than in these faraway rural areas, and that these are national icons, and therefore the museum's responsibility is really to collect them for study and, of course, for future generations. The counter arguments really show a great deal of sophistication and political savvy on the parts of local claimants, and you see some of them here. Perhaps the most common one that I see in the petitions is that these are not archaeological items. These are religious images and do not fall under the purview of the colonial government, that they are really important objects that are community owned and mark important traditional boundaries and community land ownership, and without them in place, those will disintegrate, particularly important given what is happening in this colonial period and the way that there are huge changes to the landscape and its ownership and use. Also really important are the ideas that these icons, these bronze icons in particular, confer protection to the community against a whole series of calamities, particularly disease and agricultural failure, and their removal from their places would result in, true collapse of these communities. And then we see arguments that are really responding to these kind of conservation comments made by the museum. First is that they require specialized care that only communities and religious practitioners can offer and do not need scientific care. And then there's a really fantastic argument about the intention of ancient makers, that ancient makers wanted these items to only stay in this place. And so that would be quite an affront to ancient intentions, which is really an amazing comment to be making. And then there's some very clear political commentaries being made saying, we voted for you. You told us that you would help us. We will not vote for you again if this comes to pass. So we really see this kind of a range of argumentation, which is extraordinary to actually have these voices preserved, because often we don't have that. And we have to really thank the kind of British bureaucracy for preserving these voices. I'll just show you probably what is one of my favorite ones. This is an example of a counter argument that has a kind of physical evidence that we can revisit. This is put forward by the religious authorities of the Sri Rangam Temple, who decided to open their own museum to care for the bronze objects that were slated to go to the government museum for preservation. So the argument that the museum had made that said damaged religious icons are naturally archaeological objects, the religious authority said they may be damaged, but we have our own museum and we have our own ability to care for them. Now, while a significant number of items were returned to requesting communities, the government museum still became a major repository for archaeological bronzes. And by the late 1920s, nearly 300 of them were, quote, suffering from a contagious disease, unquote, which threatened to completely destroy them. This is a chemical process called bronze disease, which is the result of copper chlorides efflorescing and powdering on the metal surface. And you can see some of these bright patches on the bronze shown here. And it was the need to treat this bronze disease on archaeological bronzes that the government museum originally did not want that led to the creation of the first museum-based laboratory in India. So I've written elsewhere about this work, and I will share this link in the chat, perhaps at the end of this talk. And I'll only briefly mention the story of the Chemical Conservation Laboratory, which was then founded in 1930. Now, under the leadership of Dr. S. Parameshivan, this custom-built laboratory developed techniques for the cleaning and study of archaeological bronzes, particularly the technique of electrolytic cleaning, a means by which corroded bronzes were submerged in large tanks filled with sodium hydroxide, and electric current passed through the solution, converting corrosion into metallic copper. And here you can see an image with the electrolytic tanks on the left, and a before and after conservation treatment image of a bronze on the right, which shows the kind of miraculous way in which this treatment made long hidden details reappear, turning corroded bronze into something that looked quite brand new. So once conserved, some of the bronzes went on display in glass cases in the museum, and the archives document the curiosity, confusion, and even veneration the presence of the gods behind glass roused in some Indian visitors. Records show that museum staff had to regularly clean off the sacred vermilion powder that devotees would smear on the glass in front of their deities, and how the bronze displays were covered in handprints after a busy visitation day. And I was told anecdotally that this still sometimes happens even in the new bronze galleries, which you see on the right. But walking through this space today with God seated alone in separate glass cases, it's hard not to be reminded of that spider, a specimen preserved but bottled up and isolated in clear fluid, because preservation makes us do some strange things. The legacy of this conservation laboratory, or perhaps any conservation laboratory, I would say, is complicated. And perhaps conservation has always negotiated this uncomfortable space of conserving heritage through a scientific care that displaces community care, and that believes in the ability of an institution to preserve things for the people of the future rather than prioritizing the people of the present. Now, one further example of how scientific conservation is intertwined with colonial and commercial interests is this one. This report on the Conservation Laboratory's work in 1942-43 mentions that the privately owned British capital-backed Madras and Southern Maratha Railway provided facilities for the investigation of ancient Indian iron and bronze objects. It specifically mentions R. Lean, chief mechanical engineer, and Mr. KPS Nair, metallurgist, and you can see them indicated in the red box. Now, here's where things get weird, or maybe even prophetic. This is Mr. KPS Nair, the man working on the study of the very same ancient bronzes I went to India to study nearly 70 years after this report was written, is in fact my paternal grandfather. So, what happens then when your familial kin suddenly becomes your professional kin? Searching for more evidence of my grandfather's work turned up references like this acknowledgement on the lower left in a scientific journal article by Paramashivan, and I believe that the metallographic cross-sections in the museum laboratory today might in fact have been made by him. As a metallurgist for the railways, my grandfather's day job was to ensure that the metal parts of trains and the railway track they ran on functioned well for the extraction and movement of Indian goods and people. These same railways deforested vast swaths of South India, churned up ancient objects to be preserved in the museum, created research projects to be carried out in the metallography laboratory, and eventually brought me back to India as a researcher and a conservator, a strange heritage. Part 2, the conservator versus the conservationist. And now I'd like to introduce a project that I'm currently working on. It's still very much in the early stages, so I would be very interested in your thoughts and perhaps directions where I might take this. So I'd like to now introduce you to my maternal grandfather, V. Madhavan Pillai, the figure in the center of this new research project. And here he is in a photograph taken soon after his marriage to my grandmother, circa 1940. And I'll just ask you to note the small pin attached to his lapel. So if my paternal grandfather was literally in the laboratory working on the conservation of ancient bronzes, at the same time, my maternal grandfather was out in the field laboratory, the forests of the kingdom of Travancore to the west of the Madras presidency. He died very young, only in his 20s, and his job title when he died was Chief Conservator of Forests. So, I've yet to find records of him in India, though I hope to in the next few years, and perhaps the person I thought was a conservationist, in fact, is also a conservator. But he did show up here, in the British Library's database. And here you see my text to my parents as soon as my husband's search turned up this record in London, a place we never expected to find him. We knew he had been in the United Kingdom in the early 1930s, not in London, but in Edinburgh, Scotland, where he went at the age of 20 to do his training in forestry. And here you can see, if anyone puts in a search for his names, you will pull up the record for his duplicate passport, and more on that in a second. That my grandfather held tightly to his Edinburgh training as a point of pride is clear in this wedding portrait. The pin he's wearing is, in fact, the crest of the University of Edinburgh, and one of the few physical artifacts we have of his is this painted wooden plaque of the university's crest, one that is so weathered that Edinburgh Castle is nearly obliterated from view. Now, this is the forestry course catalog, and I've marked in blue all of the courses that he took between October 1933 and June 1935 when he graduated. And it's really remarkable that the University of Edinburgh maintains these records, something that I was able to consult last summer when I traveled there with my parents. So among the classwork in geology and botany are also courses in, quote, forest utilization, and of course, forest mensuration and valuation, a reminder of the ways that this education was meant to prepare Indian forestry officers for work that fit colonial demands. And it's interesting which courses he took, and in fact, which courses he didn't take. He doesn't seem to have been particularly interested in forest mycology. It seems that forest engineering was not something he particularly enjoyed. and he doesn't seem to have taken Indian and colonial forest working plans, the tutorial. So it is rather curious how these courses were decided. And I would have loved to have been in the room where, the conversation with the advisors was, this is what you should be taking or not taking. And here it says, at the very bottom, candidates for Indian and Colonial Forest Service appointments. It is recommended that all candidates proposing to apply for appointments in the Forest Service under the Indian or colonial or other administration in the tropics should take the extra course in Indian and colonial forest trees. And that is something he, in fact, did. So let's take a look at the course descriptions, which makes this kind of training clearer. The course on forest protection, taught by Ferguson, lists man among the hazards that forests must endure, and man's danger rests in, quote, the theft of produce, damage to property, and protection of boundaries. Here's the course on Indian and colonial forest trees that people who plan to go into the forestry service in the colonies were expected to take, which is something he did. And in this case, it's taught by someone named J.L.S. Smith. And I really have to wonder how dissonant it must have been to have been learning about subtropical Indian colonial forest trees in the cold rain of Edinburgh. And here too, how strange to think of trees in terms of timber value, which seems to have been one of the primary aspects of this course. And I can't help but point out that there was a forestry museum and even a forest entomology museum. I mean, speak of highly specialized museums. And it really makes me wonder if my grandfather spent any time in those places among those bits and pieces and specimens taken from his home and museumified into specimens in Edinburgh. Now, there's one extraordinary practical course, 2 weeks spent in Dunkeld, Scotland, that seems very much like an outdoor training laboratory. And it's all about dividing and measuring out parcels of land, and of course, understanding local and other markets. Now, remarkably, we actually have other corroboration that this course, in fact, took place. This is one half of a letter that still remains, again, remarkably preserved in my mother's possession. And it is dated from April 1934. And my grandfather writes, during the last 2 weeks, I was at Dunkeld, which is where this fifth practical course takes place. It is a place 80 miles north of Edinburgh for my practical forestry. During these 2 weeks, I have practical here in the university forest. So this idea that the university itself maintains forests is also really fascinating. The climate is very cold. I am working with spades, manvetti, which is written in Tamil, axes, etc., in knee-deep snow and intense cold, like our coolies in the paddy field. My hands are full of blisters. Mere words fail to describe the cold. Face and ears give pain when exposed to snow, hail, and cold winds. I mean, this really kind of captures the strangeness of a man from tropical South India, transplanted to these Scottish forests where he's supposedly learning how to care for subtropical and tropical forests from his Scottish and English professors. Even more remarkable, then, is this image of the actual coursework taken by well-known photographer A.F. Mackenzie, showing my grandfather among his cohort of forestry students at Dunkeld. It's hard to look at this image and not think again of an isolated specimen taken out of its home environment and bottled up in a strange one. And my first impression of this picture was to imagine my grandfather quite separate from his ruddy British classmates. But subsequent research through other family photographs, the University of Edinburgh archives, Google searching, a lot of Google searching, and Ancestry.com tell a much more complicated story, one of interracial friendships that seem to have been possible even during a deeply racist period in Edinburgh. In fact, forestry is a popular subject for many other Indian students. And by looking again at the University of Edinburgh archives, it's clear that my grandfather is only one of other Indian students, though he's the only one in this particular image. And there were certainly Indian students in the cohort before and after his year. Now, his education in Edinburgh was not solely about forestry, but in fact, a different kind of education was also taking place. As a non-white student, my grandfather was denied university accommodation and so lived with other brown and black students at the International Hostel. And here you see him in the red box among his hostel mates. This was his home away from home, a place where he rubbed shoulders with people who became quite important in political circles. And I'll mention briefly Monty Nyker, the man in the front row in the pinstripe suit, who would go on to do important anti-apartheid work in South Africa. And he is sitting next to the Ghanaian doctor and artist, Oku Ampofo, who trained as a doctor in Edinburgh, but he was already involved in anti-colonial activism during his time in Edinburgh as a student and later became a renowned artist. And my grandfather himself attended events at the Edinburgh Indian Students Association, which did have an important political arm. So one has to think about the strangeness, perhaps, of studying forestry by day, but being involved in these other conversations by evening. And I really wish that I had more of a sense of the texture of that life, perhaps that dichotomy or something that he himself was able to reconcile. And that's something I'm still very much in search of. But on August 31st, 1935, my grandfather returned to India, and that is when a duplicate of his passport was left behind in the UK. And this seems to have been a practice required of colonial subjects studying in the UK. They needed to bring a duplicate passport, and when they left the UK, that duplicate passport was left in the UK, perhaps as a kind of evidence, still unclear to me. And this duplicate passport is the document that can still be consulted in the Asian and African Studies reading room of the British Library. I've met my grandfather twice now on the green desks here, once in 2020 on my own, and last year when I took my parents to see him. And this summer, I hope to introduce my children to their great-grandfather. Now, it's hard to put into words what this experience was like. Of course, there's the miracle of survival and the conservation of this precious document, that tangible connection to this man that I've never met and yet feel I know. But it's also extremely hard to have to visit and leave him behind. These messages exchanged between me and my family members after my first encounter with the passport bring to mind the same questions that communities raised when their deities were taken away from them for the museum for reasons of preservation. I'm struck by the parallels between local claimants' need to prove ownership of their gods in order to have them restituted and my own sense of ownership of this passport. Whom else does this belong to, if not me and my family? And what of all the other passports, thousands of them held in the British Library's collections, and those family members? Now, I've written elsewhere about my own sense of gratitude to my professional kin, those archivists and conservators who kept this document safe for, 100 years so that I could find it one day. But it's impossible not to have complicated feelings about the work that they do and that I do, knowing in my own body now just how personal the stakes are. As conservators, we preserve specimens, but all of these beings, all of these things were perhaps once alive. In this talk, I've put the conservator and the conservationist in opposition, but if my own experience is of use, it is to show that they have more in common than I've realized. And perhaps the linkage I've been searching for, that connection that I wanted between these two projects, is as simple as me. I am, in fact, the link, the granddaughter of two colonized subjects, conservator and conservationist. So I continue to struggle with how to tell the stories of these two grandfathers, how they intersect, how they tell a more complicated narrative about the long personal and professional legacies of conservation in a colonial context. And I continue to struggle with what a post-colonial or decolonized or anti-colonial kind of recovery might look like, and more importantly, feel like. But this too is heritage, a heritage I carry from two bloodlines. Thank you so much.